Hello and welcome. I'm Abha Bakai, and we're going to be analyzing what this budget had in store for startups this time around. A lot was expected. Did the finance minister deliver? To help me answer that question, we've got Ajit Khurana, angel investor, Bipin Preet Singh, the founder of MobiKwik, Adil Shetty, CEO at bankbazaar.com, Rishi Anand, the partner at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, and Milind Kothari, managing partner and head direct tax at BDO India. All of you, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. Ajit, let me just kickstart with you because, you know, we had the huge Startup India, Stand Up India event that was counting down, and really that was raising expectations for startups as to what would be expected this time in the budget. I have to say, you know, right off the bat that I'm not sure the budget delivered in terms of funding or incentives, but did it deliver at least along the lines of what was announced in Startup India?
See, in principle, I find that a lot of statements made in Startup India were very exciting, and we were hoping that they would get enshrined in policy by virtue of the budget. I'm not very happy on that count. Let me give you an example of why I feel that way. On the one hand, we are talking about tax exemption for startups for the first 3 years under certain eligibility criteria, which I think very few of them will meet. On the other hand, as per section 56(2)(7)(b, to get technical, we are actually taxing them when they have not even made revenue, leave alone profit, in the format of angel tax. What that means is that if the assessing officer deems that you have raised investment at a price higher than fair market value, you're going to have to pay tax when you raise money from angel investors. This doesn't make sense. Right. It's okay if you were to tax profits when we make profits, but why tax people when they're raising investors' money?
Absolutely. So, Mr. Kothari, I'm going to come to you on this. I'm going to get into the deep end, you know, right at the start. But, you know, the entire taxation debate has been a long-standing one when it comes to the startup community. They've been crying out for parity for a long time. I mean, when do you see some of these, you know, some of these sort of irregularities really easing up and making things easier for the ecosystem?
So this was expected that this relief would be granted and this section would be removed. It was a recommendation that was already there, including by the ISWA committee. Surprisingly, it has not been taken care of in this budget. And on top of it, even the new sections that have been inserted or proposed to be inserted for providing tax relief or deductions to the startups, I think there is a room for improvement in terms of what was the expectations of the community as opposed to what the finance minister delivered. There is clearly a big gap out there. Although no one expected that finance minister is going to give money on the table, notwithstanding that, I think there could have been a much better fine print that could have been delivered to the community, I would say.
Adil, let me bring you in here on the taxation front. Do you feel that perhaps more could have been done, or do you feel that we still saw some element of intent shine through?
You know, I definitely think we saw some element of intent shine through. So, for example, there were two things we were asking for in terms of parity with public stock, right? So, one was the period for eligibility for long-term capital gains, which is currently 3 years for us, and it's 1 year for a public market stock. We were asking for a reduction. The positive is that came through. So, now 3 years has become 2 years. So, an angel investor selling after 2 years is eligible for long-term capital gains. Now, we were also asking for that 20% index long-term capital gains to come closer to, you know, zero, right? Now, I think that obviously it hasn't happened, but I say measure the intent, right? The very fact that they have taken a disparity and looked to normalize it, I think is positive. Building on Startup India, I think we believe that if you look forward, right, we can expect this long-term capital gain for startups to keep coming down, and we think the intent is positive.
All right. Rishi, let me bring you in here. I know you've also been looking at this in a lot of detail and looking at what startups were anticipating. But, you know, I read some of your notes and you've already stated some of these developments, particularly the capital gains front, as dicey. So I want you to explain that to me a little bit.
See, from the taxation perspective, if, you know, they have said that there will be no capital gains on the income made out of, you know, on sale of shares of from the startups. However, the problem over here is that whether or not how this income, when they have also actually made a restriction that while these incomes are non-taxable, but they need to be invested in funds of funds. So what will happen when you make a gain out of funds of funds? So technically, these issues are not so clear, at this point of time. So we need to really see that how the entire budget unfolds in the coming period, because there's a lot of uncertainty right now on these front. However, on the positive side, the 2 points which I would really like to make. One is the Unified Agriculture Marketing e-platform, which again is a very good move if at all is taken in the right direction. It will essentially help farmers and e-commerce companies to build up a platform where the farm produce can directly be taken to the consumers or to the retail stores or probably to the wholesalers. This will actually eradicate the entire mandi system. However, there will be a lot of amendments that will be required to made at the different state level in the APMC Acts. Second, another positive move which is there I see, again, in the transportation sector, we represent number of clients who are into transportation sector, essentially aggregators, okay? People of likes of Uber, Ola, Zipgo, people like them. If you see that there are no set of regulations at this point of time which actually governs any of the aggregators of transportation services. That is something, if government comes up with a regime where these startup companies, there are no more startups, but again, these aggregators of transport services can be brought into the legal regime, and there is a set of rules which may define them as as a business, and they can function in that form.
All right, fair enough. So that's one pocket of the market as well that we're looking out for, that further few more regulations, in fact, were possibly missing that we needed some clarity on. Let me get Bipin in as well at this point. Bipin, coming from your standpoint, when it comes to the financial technology space as well, what did you feel the finance minister did manage to do for the ecosystem, and what did you feel was lacking?
I think, I'm not sure about today's announcement, but I think a few days earlier there was news that digital payments or electronic payments would not have any surcharge or would not have convenience fee, especially, government institutions, who are, or any kind of institutions who are, today disincentivizing customers for collecting payments in the form of electronic payments, or even merchants, sometimes which ask for 1% or 2% for customer to pay, whether they are paying offline or online. I think if that happens, and if we remove the service charges or the convenience fees, at least for the, the entities which come under the purview of the government, that's a great welcome start, because remember that in India still 95 to 96% of all bills are paid in cash by people who are going into and standing in queues. And I think giving some kind of, at least leveling the playing field with cash, goes a long way to do that. The second, I think the big news for me is, especially for fintech, all fintech startups and companies, as well as banks, is the news about Aadhaar, which is going to get the legal status. And I think that's a very big development, because over the past 2 years since this government came into power, there have been many discussions, and there have been many debates, and there was slight confusion on what is really going to happen to Aadhaar, and would that really form the basis of identity of about 1.2 billion Indians. And I think if it gets legal status, I think it will go a long way to provide financial inclusion and financial services to billions of Indians, because that's one big roadblock that every financial company faces today. So I think these two for me were the major highlights. Of course, as an entrepreneur, as a startup entrepreneur, I cannot expect every single announcement to cater only to startups. We are a country of 1.2 billion Indians, millions, hundreds and millions of farmers. And I think the country needs to develop also. At the same time, we just cannot keep expecting SOPs for startups all the time.
Fair enough. although the word startup and entrepreneur were used several times in that budget speech today, not necessarily always in the context we would have liked, but taking that digitization point forward, Adil, I want to bring you in here as well, because you were talking about this earlier, and I think it's important to note that along with perhaps acknowledging some amount of some amount of steps that were required on the taxation front for the startup community, the entire Digital India program as a whole is starting to take shape, and that, as Vipin was also mentioning, has larger implications. Absolutely.
I think the intent was again displayed in the budget, right? So there's statutory backing for Aadhaar, which is a big deal because a lot of eKYC runs on top of Aadhaar. There was also a mention, right, of a digital depository where university degrees can be placed and managed as a secure document. I think the thought process saying, how do we enable electronic verification? How do we create a depository? How do we make Aadhaar statutory? Are all the right intent, right? They're all thinking about how do you democratize finance. And I think that even though these are in the small print, like the digital depository, it's a big deal, especially for fintech startups.
All right, we need to take a very quick break. We'll come back and continue to analyze what this budget means for startups and the community. We'll be back in just a moment. We'll look at it both from a legal, taxation, and of course, sentimental standpoint as well. Back in just a moment. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. We're in conversation with our panel of guests on what this budget means for startups, and the one takeaway, even if we leave aside the debate of whether or not there was enough in the budget in terms of funding or incentives, the one other takeaway that's clearly coming through is on the taxation front, that there's still a real need for further clarity, and there's still too much uncertainty. Ajit, I want to come back to you because there are still several points that the finance minister did not touch upon. And, as you were also mentioning earlier, there were things that just seem to be forgotten for now. If you could take us through what some of those key points would be.
Correct. In addition to the angel tax that I listed earlier, I also feel that the way stock options or profits arising from stock options are taxed in India makes it very inconvenient, or rather it discourages employees from exercising their options because they are not taxed when they are making a profit. I think that globally, if you look at how employees are taxed on stock options or angel investors are taxed on their angel investing, we actually see that the governments there are encouraging capital formation at the early stage. Right. In India, I find it to be discouraging. As a result, I would recommend that this government has a bunch of very good programs. The next program that I recommend is Stay in India. Okay. So that startups, find a friendly tax regime compatible with the tax regimes abroad and do not want to change their domicile, go abroad because of tax reasons and policy reasons.
Right. So do you think that perhaps steps could be taken, Mr. Kothari, to achieve that? What can we see on that front? Because this is actually quite a big issue.
See, if you look at the number of moving pieces here in taxation, is one being the company itself, which is been given the deductions in this budget. And as you mentioned, angel investor has his own set of issues. Then you have issues on stock options, how they're getting taxed in India. And what this budget is addressed is the corporate taxation and a deduction being given. 3 out of 5 years, you don't need to pay taxes, 100% deduction is being given. The question is who makes profit in the first 5 years, and are you really giving a benefit to the startup community as such? Now that's a big question, and if you see the landscape and also look at what is being given here is a deduction only to new products and services being launched by the companies. It's not given to any company that's called itself as a startup. So that's not what is meant under the income tax law, unfortunately. So if you really break it into parts, what you really discover is that there is not much of an offering here from a tax rebate perspective that startup community can say sit back and say you've got this great benefit in the budget. That's not happening as yet.
I would like to add here about this tax exemption for 3 out of 5 years, which I think is, by the way, addition to what we heard in Stand Up India, where it was the first 3 years. Now they said 3 out of the first 5 years. The point is, how do you define these companies? These have been defined on 6 objective criteria, and the 7th criteria is discretion at the hands of an interministerial committee. This is really scary to me. When I talk to founders, they're like, so we're going to send an application to a bunch of government officials who will then deem whether my offering is innovative. That is the key word.
Yeah.
If you are innovative and if you meet a certain set of criteria and if the interministerial committee agrees that you are defined as a startup, then you get tax exemption, assuming you made profits in the first place.
So that
this
definition is still...
Yeah, so this is not very encouraging.
Okay, so not too happy with that either. Rishi, let me bring you in here. I want to get your view on some of the thoughts that we've just been discussing. And, whether or not you feel, we keep hearing the whole, phrase ease of doing business. But when it comes to startups, have we really seen enough to enable that? When we're looking at the introduction of the bill to amend the Companies Act, for example, is that, do you feel, going to have an impact on ground?
Okay, they have mentioned that one-day registration of a company under the new bill. However, to what extent actually it's going to help? For startups, right now for establishing a company it takes you around 2 to 3 weeks time period. So this is not something which is a benefit per se. Of course, it will definitely create an environment where a new setup can be formulated in a shorter duration of time. But I would have been expecting more benefits in terms of, it's mentioned by other speakers as well, that the benefit of taxation from the day when you actually go profitable, instead of having a restriction of 3 years where most of the startups might not even go profitable, and there is a pressure from the investors where you just need to burn money and create numbers over profitability. If you see how a startup functions in today's scenarios, it's not making profits, but what are the numbers you're actually calculating? So that is something what would have been more beneficial in the interest of the startup community.
Adil, I think you also have a point here.
No, I feel that also we should give some credit over here, right? Because when we first incorporated back in 2008, it took us 30 days to get everything done. It was a lot of time for an entrepreneur to run around and do paperwork. In the last quarter, right, we've registered entities both in India, wholly owned subsidiary, and abroad. Okay. India took 2 weeks flat. And 2 weeks flat, right, is as long as it takes in most foreign countries. If they can do this in a day, hats off to them. Okay. Like, let's give credit to some of these intentions too.
All right, I've got a consensus here, at least on that point as well. Okay, we just to sort of get a few more highlights from the budget as we wind down. Bipin, I want to bring you back in here as well and get a sense of, really the mood going forward, just taking from what everyone's really said in terms of really, the government really pressing on all fronts to really try and get things going for startups, not just perhaps in the way we see them in the tech space, but also smaller companies, young professionals, encouraging them to go out and start off on their own. Do you really feel, things are coming together really for the community?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think just from a intent point of view, just from a signaling point of view, I think this government has done the more than any other government in the past. I would say 60 years after independence. Saying that you can start up and you should start up and stand up and create your own business rather and be an employer rather than be an employee. Having said that, I think a lot of the announcements and a lot of the changes that are being discussed right now are still, I would say, they are not the big impact changes. For example, we were discussing registration of a startup in a day. I think that's great, and it will maybe but is that the big decision that a startup entrepreneur needs to make? Like, if you cannot invest 2 weeks into making the effort to start up, then how are you going to survive 3 years or 10 years to make your startup work? I think just from the point of view of an entrepreneur, if we are running a startup, what I expected and what we have been asking for is sort of a single window platform just to manage tax and compliance. And I think if you can ask any entrepreneur in this country, I think half of us don't understand Companies Act or Companies Law or whatever it is in such big detail, although it has been revised over periods of time. I think just to manage that tax and compliance make it very, very easy, make it single window, is something that will enable a lot of startup entrepreneurs to start focusing on innovation and growth rather than running to different departments, hiring several people in order to manage compliance. And I think that's been my key learning over the last 5 to 6 years.
All right, we need to get a quick round of closing comments coming in as well. So Mr. Kothari, let me start off with you.
So the question is that what is the benefit that's given in the budget? Obviously, there's a deduction for startups, which is a tax deduction on income. But what's not gone out of the system is a compliance. So you have compliance on TDS, you have compliance on indirect taxes, you have compliance on making your accounts and then getting an audit done. So there is a host of compliances that are still required to be done by startup, which is not going to get out of the window at this point of time. So just by itself, as I said, the tax deduction which is given, whether you have profits or not in the first place, whether this deduction means anything in the first place, question mark. But yes, there's a plethora of compliance still need to be done regardless of that. So that's not changing here for much.
Okay, and Rishi, as you were saying, and you work with so many different founders as well, just to get your closing comments, do you also agree that things continue to look a little complicated for now? What would you like to see going ahead?
No, I think it's definitely there are positive moves. Somebody has actually spoken about startups. That is more positive for me over anything else. And yes, I think there's a lot of emphasis which has been made on the innovation. And that is, I think, for the reason because government wants more and more entrepreneurs to come up with their ideas which are not run-of-the-mill job, where if you see, there's another advantage of they have actually mentioned of taxing patents which are registered in India at the rate of 10%. That is again promoting something which is not there. So this budget for startups, I would say, more than tax benefits or more than any financial incentives, it is more a promotional budget for the startups, where startups have been recognized and where startups have been given a platform. Okay, you start with your business and we'll see what all benefits there are available. We will give you, and again, we'll have to see that how all these benefits actually unfold and how government comes with an action plan where these incentives are actually executed rather just remaining in the books.
All right, we're completely out of time, so I just have time for very, very quick closing comments, just 30 seconds, Adil.
For fintech in general, for Bank Bazaar, I think statutory backing for Aadhaar, digital depository, all very positive moves. I think this is a building block. We need to see a lot more steps taking from this good foundation to figure out how we can, automate and digitize and democratize finance.
Ajit.
3 sentences. First, congratulations to the government for checkboxing several of the important things. Second, however, a lot more needs to be done. And third, it all gets down to execution. Policies are great, but let's get them on the ground right.
All right, so intent is clear and everyone's happy with the step in the right direction. Ajit, I know you have a very long list of things that just weren't touched upon. We'll have to leave that for another time. Thank you all so much for joining us on the show today. Absolutely great chatting with you. Thanks so much.